This is Calista. I think you'll recognize this guy. And as I said, a warm Florida welcome. Thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate it. You know I do.
Thank you.
We've been friends for many years.
Well, I don't know, do I need the mic or can you hear me? I think my mic in some bizarre way and it's working. So, let me say, first of all, Cliff and I are delighted to be here. And of course, as many of you know from personal experience, it's virtually impossible to turn Betty down. Although I must say that Mel has certain sales techniques. I think it started out as, why don't you drop down for a quiet couple days? We'll hang out, relax. We literally got back last night from, or the day before yesterday, rather, from China. We'd spent 16 days in Tokyo and Seoul and Beijing and 3 other Chinese cities. So we got in about 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock the day before yesterday. So in our minds, we're not quite sure what time of day this is. But we originally scheduled this because we knew it would be a casual, private, informal get-together. And then Betty called and said, well, you know, since you're coming down anyway, why don't we do this little event? And I don't know about the rest of you, I find it virtually impossible to say no to her. So, I mean, had Mel called, I could have worked my way out of it. But I'm glad you're here. I just know how many years they both put into what is a very long and very difficult process. And, you know, one which tends to, I think, have ebb and flow. We have been in a struggle going back really to the late 60s and reached its first sort of peak of confusion in the late 70s, and then under tremendous leadership from Nancy and Ronald Reagan, we began to reframe what this whole debate about drugs is about and about where we were going, and really began to establish policies which had a substantial positive influence until the Clinton administration, which was confused. It wasn't that it was necessarily aggressively pro-drug, it was just confused. And the president himself had not been a particularly good role model. And as a result, drug use became slightly more acceptable, but then under George W. Bush, we began to rebuild the momentum we'd had under Reagan and under George H.W. Bush. And now we're back at a point of I think, not sure which side is an offense and which side is a defense. And it's been affected in part because for reasons that I think have, to a peculiar degree, never been explored by the media, George Soros has a passion for a drug-addicted America. And why he is so deeply in favor of drug addiction, I don't know. But you have a multi-billionaire who is prepared to spend substantial amounts of money trying to shape public policy and shape public opinion in a way which has been very consistently in favor of drug addiction, very consistently in favor of trying to find ways to legalize drugs. And I think as a result, we now find ourselves back in a fight almost in the environment we were in the late 1970s. This is compounded by something else that most of us, I think, underestimated very dramatically, and that is that if you continue over time to pour the quantity of money that has been poured into illegal organizations, they grow dramatically more sophisticated. So if I first had this explained to me by George Tenet when he was still at the CIA, and he said that there is a gray world. He said that the underside of globalization is the emergence of illegality captured in part by the Colombian cartels, by the Albanians, who are probably the leading ethnic group that organized crime in Europe, by the scale of drugs grown in Afghanistan, and by the war that we're seeing now in Mexico. And imagine that you now have drug dealers who have the scale of money that, for example, allows the Colombian cartels to literally build submarines in the jungle, bring them down, fill them with cocaine. They're usually semi-submersible. They don't quite go underwater, but they almost go underwater. And they're then driven up along the west coast of Mexico and ultimately beached very close to the United States. And they're usually run by 2 or 3 people. And the profit from a 10 to 15 ton shipment of cocaine is so massive that they just walk off and leave the submarine behind. Because subs cost about $1 million if you build them in the jungle, because these are not combat subs in the American Navy sense. These are just cargo vessels that are underwater. But imagine the infrastructure to be able to get all the parts and all the stuff up the river, to be able to assemble it, to then bring it back down the river. I mean, these are really sophisticated, complex systems. And the point that Tena made to me, this was now 8 years ago, was that when you look around the world, these organizations have very substantial amounts of cash. And they are not limited by bureaucratic rules. So whatever length of time it takes, for example, for law enforcement to acquire a new radio, and to go through the process of putting it out to bid, getting the government to agree to pay for it, getting it into the system, training people on how to use it, the drug dealer just gets online and orders 600 and pays cash. And so it's a very interesting and very different environment than any of us had historically expected. And as a result, you have now between the Russian mafia, the Sicilian mafia, the Colombian mafia, the Mexican mafia, and the Albanian and Afghanistan groups, you have networks around the planet of people engaged in illegality who have collectively a very high level of sophistication. And it forms a fundamentally different challenge than anything we've ever seen before. And I think it is very much underestimated by our elites and by our news media, who really don't feel comfortable dealing with it directly, and who don't realize how profound the problem is, and how deeply it goes. And so I wanted to start with this core notion. You cannot talk about the existence of large amounts of illegal behavior without looking at the effect that has on growing a culture of people prepared to be illegal. And if you look at the level of violence, for example, in Mexico, it should be a very real warning to us. I mean, we live, the rule of law, the process of being physically safe, the notion that you're not going to be preyed upon by somebody who is more ruthless and more brutal than you are, really is a very fragile thing. It works as long as it works. And when it starts to break down, it can have horrifying consequences. And I think that we have been really living at the margins of having the system get much, much worse now for a long time. I believe that you will see by 2012 a really serious national debate over fundamentally rethinking how we take on illegal drugs and how we deal with the whole issue of illegal behavior. This is part of what's at the heart of the fight over whether or not to control the border. And the whole notion that how can you talk about being a sovereign country if you literally have no control over who's coming across the border every day. I think it's also part of the whole fight about trying to understand how these illegal organizations operate. About 4 years ago, I did a 1-hour film for Fox on MS-13, which is a El Salvadorian gang that's very, very violent and is in about 65 American cities. And it's a really severe problem because these people really represent almost a third world mentality, except they're in your shopping center. And so, I mean, one of the ways you can tell if they're in the area is if people are having their arms cut off by machetes. This is not normal behavior. And these are people who have access to the modern world, but they have the violence and the predatory behavior of a very primitive culture. And they exist side by side with us. And it's going to lead to very significant challenges in the next 5